Looks good to me.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing addressing a topic that we can all pretty much agree on. Illegal and abusive robocalls must end. No one is immune to these illegal and potentially dangerous calls. It's no surprise that unsolicited robocalls consistently rank among the top consumer complaints to the Federal Trade Commission and to the Federal Communications Commission. One report estimated that robocallers rang Americans' mobile phones over 26 billion times last year alone. Illegal and abusive robocalls are a clear problem, but it's important to remember that automated calls are not inherently negative. Many important services are carried out via such calls when companies and call recipients have a pre-established relationship. For example, if you're on your way to the airport and your flight is canceled, if there's a fraud alert on your credit card, or if you're being reminded of an upcoming medical appointment, those are calls that are important to consumers. Different rules of the road apply to these types of calls, and they should. Our focus today is on the unscrupulous use of robocalls, something that has earned bipartisan scorn. Almost a year ago, when I was chairman of the Commerce Committee, I subpoenaed the mass robocaller Adrian Abramovich to testify about his operation. He's facing $120 million in FCC penalties for making nearly 100 million robocalls throughout the country. His testimony shed light on the reality that many robocallers view the risk of getting caught and paying civil fines as a cost of business. Illegal calling operations are often based abroad and can disappear quickly when authorities seek to hold them accountable. Since bringing up Mr. Abramovich, I introduced the Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence, or TRACE Act, with Senator Markey, bipartisan legislation targeting the worst of the worst, scam artists and others who knowingly violate the law. A credible threat of criminal prosecution is necessary and appropriate for those who knowingly flout laws to prey upon the elderly and other vulnerable populations. The TRACE Act mandates that federal law enforcement, state attorneys general, and telecommunications experts work together to determine what systems and what potential modifications to our laws will create a credible threat of prosecution and prison for those who intentionally violate the law. I've also heard from federal enforcers that requiring a warning citation before the FCC can act against an illegal robocaller and the current one-year statute of limitations necessitating the initiation of a fine within a year from when an illegal call is made are hampering their ability to hold bad actors accountable. The TRACE Act will give the FCC 3 years to identify robocallers who intentionally violate the law and eliminates the need for a preliminary citation. New technologies have also made it easier for scammers to hide from law enforcement and seek to gain their victims' trust by using a technique known as spoofing, where they display fake caller ID information. The goal of scammers using spoofed robocalls is often to get money out of unsuspecting recipients, and some of their methods can be particularly malicious. The TRACE Act tackles the frustrating issue of spoofing by requiring the FCC to adopt an industry-developed framework for call authentication. And importantly, the bill makes it easier for carriers to lawfully block calls that aren't properly authenticated. Ultimately, this will help stop such calls from reaching your phone. These improvements may not stop every illegal robocall, but they will go a long way toward making it safe to answer your phone again. That's why I'm pleased that the Commerce Committee unanimously reported the TRACE Act out of committee last week and that it is now moving to the full Senate for consideration. I'm also grateful for Senator Markey for partnering with me on this legislation. I will work to get the TRACE Act to the President's desk as soon as possible. I mentioned earlier that solving this issue is going to require a variety of stakeholders to get together. Today we have the opportunity to hear from the Honorable Doug Peterson, who serves as the Attorney General for the state of Nebraska. State Attorneys General are actively enforcing do-not-call laws and educating consumers about scam robocalls. Industry has also been working diligently to develop new call authentication technology to provide consumers relief from illegal robocalls. So I'm glad to welcome Mr. Kevin Ruppy and Ms. Margot Saunders of the National Consumer Law Center, who can speak to these efforts. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I'll hand it off now to Senator Schatz for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. This is an important issue. It's an issue that crosses state lines, party lines, phone lines, and unites all Americans. We've all heard complaints from constituents about robocalls, stories about people being harassed by debt collectors, about calls on mobile phones with familiar-looking caller ID numbers that turn out to be fake. I got a text from my mother on Tuesday. I am reaching out to my senator. I just got spam calls to my own landline, supposedly from my landline. What is the regular person supposed to do except grin and bear it? So I texted back, on it. Robocalls have turned us into a nation of call screeners, only picking up when we are sure it is a number that we know. And I think this is an important sort of underappreciated downside to robocalls. It's not just the nuisance. Certainly the fraud is the biggest deal. But the fact that a lot of people don't use their phones as phones anymore for that reason is a significant economic issue, and it needs to be addressed. The first step towards taking on robocalls is to make sure that the enforcers have the authority that they need. That's why in the last Congress I reintroduced the Robocall Enforcement Enhancement Act, which would extend the FCC's statute of limitations and give it authority to fine bad actors without providing a warning. And that's why I voted to advance Senator Thune and Markey's Trace Act out of the Commerce Committee last week. But we're not going to stop this problem with enforcement alone. We also need to scale our efforts with technology. We must fight bad technology with good technology. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the prospects for using validation and blocking tools and other tech to fight back. These tools should not be an excuse for providers to make more money or invade consumers' privacy. Finally, there may be more that we can do to educate consumers. Are we doing enough to help people avoid being tricked by scams in the first place? Do they know about the tools available to identify or block unwarranted calls, or the best way to report illegal calls? I look forward to the hearing today and working with Chairman Thune and members of the subcommittee to address this frustrating issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. We're glad to be joined today by the chairman of the full committee, Senator Wicker, who was instrumental in helping us move the bill out of the committee last week. So, Senator Wicker, recognize you for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz. I agree with both of you that this is an important hearing and a very important issue that has long plagued consumers, particularly the nation's most vulnerable and underserved populations. Senator Schatz, I too got a call from Pontotoc, Mississippi, from my dad just last month about a malicious phone call. And joined the club. And I'm doing my best on that matter. As technology evolves and becomes more sophisticated, criminals and bad actors in the marketplace take advantage of new calling features to engage in illegal activity. As the chairman said, spoofing, there's neighbor spoofing, where robocallers use local numbers in hopes that recipients will be more likely to pick up the phone. Other times the robocallers engage in malicious spoofing, where the perpetrator is able to alter or manipulate caller ID information. Many have fallen victims of scams and other fraudulent schemes of this sort. I strongly support the Trace Act, which, as the chair pointed out, passed out of the full committee last week. This legislation would provide meaningful reforms to curb fraudulent and abusive robocalls. And so I thank the authors of this legislation for their leadership on this act, and I hope we can bring it to the floor in a bipartisan fashion soon. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today, and we look forward to a nice discussion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker. We're going to have, I think, Senator Fisher was here and would like to recognize you, General Peterson, but I assume she's at another, I think, Armed Services Committee hearing, so she'll be by later. But in the meantime, we'll let you all get going. I want to thank you all for being here. We have with us today, as I mentioned, the Attorney General for the state of Nebraska, Mr. Doug Peterson, followed by Mr. Kevin Ruppy, who is a partner in Wiley Ryan, representing US Telecom, the Broadband Association, and Ms. Margot Saunders of Washington, D.C. Counsel for the National Consumer Law Center. So thank you all for being here. We look forward to hearing from you and to asking you some questions. We'll start with you, Attorney General, on my left and your right, and proceed. And if you could confine your oral remarks to around 5 minutes, it'll give us optimum time to ask questions. So thank you for being here.
All right.
Please proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Schatz and the esteemed members of this subcommittee. I'm Doug Peterson, the Attorney General from the state of Nebraska. and I'm here to provide a State Attorney General's perspective on protecting consumers from the scourge of illegal robocalls and phone scammers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. State Attorney Generals are on the front line of helping consumers who are harassed and scammed by unwanted calls. Robocalls and telemarketing calls are currently the #1 source of consumer complaints for many AG offices, as well as both the FCC and the FTC. In response, Attorney Generals bring enforcement actions against telemarketers and robocallers under state and federal law, both in our individual capacities and collectively with the U.S. Department of Justice and the FTC. In 2015, 10 attorneys general partnered with the FTC to sue the Florida-based cruise line company that conducted telemarketing campaign that issued billions of robocalls. In 2017, 4 AGs and the U.S. Department of Justice obtained a $280 million judgment against Dish Network for knowingly engaging in pervasive telemarketing misconduct, such as placing repeated calls to people on the Do Not Call registry and using pre-recorded messages. However, law enforcement alone is not enough. As acknowledged in the FCC staff report on robocalls released this year, stopping illegal calls before they reach consumers is especially important because, unlike legitimate callers, these nuisance callers will not be deterred by the prospect of enforcement, knowing that they will be very difficult to locate. For more than 4 years, we've been a loud and sometimes critical voice in the fight to make call blocking a reality for consumers. September 14th, 39 AGs asked the FCC to clarify whether federal law was interfering with efforts by service providers to implement call blocking technology. Ultimately, in June of 2015, the FCC clarified that federal law does not prohibit voice service providers from offering, upon consumer request, call blocking technology. In July of 2017, AGs responded in support of the FCC's proposal to allow voice service providers to block several types of obviously spoofed robocalls, such as the originating from the unassigned telephone numbers or impossible telephone number combinations. 35 AGs submitted similar comments to the FCC in October of 2018. We have known for years that the technological solutions are a significant part of the answer. Since 2015, though, it has been up to consumers to find, purchase, and otherwise adopt call blocking technology. They have downloaded apps for their smartphones or enroll in a service provided by their carrier, yet the problem continues to grow. So we must do more, and that's why I appreciate the actions taken by the Senate in this matter. In the last 3 years, industry participants have made significant progress towards development and implementation of the call authentication framework known as STIR/SHAKEN. But even the best solutions won't help consumers if industry participants and regulators fail to collaborate on implementation. This means a widespread adoption of STIR/SHAKEN so that many consumers benefit from the caller ID authentication as possible. It also means industry-wide cooperation on traceback efforts so that law enforcement can more easily identify perpetrators of these illegal mass callings. For these reasons, just last month, Attorney Generals from all 50 states and the District of Columbia and 33 U.S. territories submitted a letter to Chairman Wicker, expressing our support of the TRACE Act. And I must say, when you get 50 AGs and the District of Columbia and 3 territory AGs, you've accomplished a significant task, and it shows really how significant this is to all the states. We believe this legislation effectively addresses many of the concerns raised by the federal regulator, service providers, private businesses, consumer advocacy groups, and other interested parties to combat illegal robocalls and spoofing. We are pleased to see that the TRACE Act requires implementation of the STIR/SHAKEN, affirms that service providers' authority to block certain calls, and creates a safe harbor for the inadvertent blocking of legitimate calls. And furthermore, the Attorney Generals are very encouraged about the interagency working group because we feel it's going to be an important partnership for state AGs to work closely with federal authorities in order to consult with solutions on this problem. I thank Senator Thune, Senator Markey, and Senator Fisher, and many of the co-sponsors of the TRACE Act for their support of this important fight. The AGs look forward to providing comments to the FCC if and when the time comes to implement accompanying regulations, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Rupi.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Schatz, members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Kevin Rupi, and I am a partner in the telecommunications media technology practice at Wiley Ryan, and I'm here today on behalf of US Telecom, the Broadband Association. US Telecom shares the committee's concerns on illegal robocalls and is pleased to support the Trace Act. Since I last testified before the Senate in 2018, there have been 3 significant developments in this area, and I would like to mention a 4th point. First, since last year, industry has undertaken considerable efforts to deploy call authentication technologies, commonly referred to as shake and stir, that will significantly enhance the ability of illegal robocallers, significantly diminish the ability of illegal robocallers to spoof caller ID information. Companies are deploying these standards into their networks today and will continue to do so throughout 2019. Second, consumers today have more tools than ever at their disposal to mitigate illegal or unwanted robocalls. Hundreds of such tools are available to consumers on their smartphones, and a broad range of voice providers are integrating these tools into their networks. Third, US Telecom's industry traceback group efforts, which seek to identify illegal robocallers, have been significantly enhanced through recent automation. The time it now takes to trace back illegal robocalls has been reduced from weeks to days, sometimes even hours. Fourth, while the federal civil enforcement actions of the FCC and FTC are laudatory and effective, increased criminal enforcement against illegal robocallers is needed. Let me briefly address each of these issues. First, the industry-led governance authority for the Shaken standard was established last year under ATIS, the standards body coordinating industry implementation of the Shaken protocol. ATIS will identify the policy administrator in May and will oversee day-to-day operations of the Shaken standard. In short, industry is moving swiftly to implement this important call authentication technology. Once implemented, the ability of illegal robocallers to spoof caller ID information will be significantly reduced, while consumer knowledge about the validity of incoming calls will increase. As this process moves forward, broad sectors of industry are already deploying the Shaken standard into their networks. Several US Telecom member companies have publicly advised the FCC of these deployment efforts, with most targeting deployments in their IP networks as soon as the end of 2019. Testing of the new technology and products is well advanced. Just last month, Comcast and AT&T successfully verified authentication of calls between their networks, and Verizon announced the first exchange of stir shaken-enabled calls to and from wireless handsets. Second, consumers today can access more tools than ever to protect them from illegal robocalls. Between October 2016 and March 2018, the number of smartphone applications available increased from 85 to 550. Equally important, more voice providers are integrating these tools into their networks. For example, AT&T provides the Call Protect service that allows its customers with certain handsets to block suspected fraudulent calls. In March of this year, Verizon rolled out new spam alerting and call blocking tools to wireless customers whose smartphones support these features. Carriers are also deploying various tools across their TDM and IP wireline networks, such as anonymous call rejection and no solicitation, and several have worked with or are currently working with NomoRobo's blocking service. Third, late last year, US Telecom's 26-member industry traceback group transitioned its manual process to one that is largely automated. The FCC recently acknowledged that US Telecom's manual process had reduced the time necessary for the agency to conduct its own investigations from months to weeks, and the automated process is expected to produce even greater efficiencies. Finally, while current federal enforcement efforts are laudatory, they are mostly limited to civil enforcement. There is an acute need for aggressive criminal enforcement against illegal robocallers at federal and state levels. Criminal syndicates engaged in illegal robocalling activity should be targeted and brought to justice through aggressive criminal enforcement efforts. We applaud the Trace Act's facilitation of these efforts. In closing, let me again thank the committee for holding this timely hearing. US Telecom shares your concerns with the scourge of illegal robocalls, and we look forward to our continued work together to address this challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Rupie. Ms. Saunders.
Chairman Thune, Senator Schatz, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity today to testify on the importance of maintaining the integrity of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act as a primary tool to address unwanted robocalls. My testimony is on behalf of the low-income clients of the National Consumer Law Center and 5 other national consumer organizations. We very much appreciate Chairman Thune and Senator Markey's leadership in this area by sponsoring the TRACE Act. We want to talk about some of the other things that need to be done. Last month, Americans received 5.2 billion robocalls, a phenomenal 370% increase since 2015. The data illustrates that the majority of robocalls are not overt scams. They are calls made by American corporations or on behalf of American corporations selling products and collecting debts. These callers claim to be the victims of a TCPA crisis, but it's a crisis of their own making. So-called legitimate businesses, often using lead generators who make the calls, are responsible for almost a billion telemarketing robocalls just last month to sell car insurance, health insurance, car warranties, home security systems, resort vacations, and more. If the rate of telemarketing non-scam calls continues at the current pace, in 2019, there'll be over 11 billion non-scam telemarketing robocalls in the United States. In addition to telemarketers, major American corporations make an enormous number of robocalls to collect debts. Many debt collection calls are made to people who are behind in their payments, but the calls are made dozens of times a week in attempt to harass people into paying. Other robocalls are made to people who have nothing to do with the debts. Examples of these harassing debt collection calls are in my testimony. A significant reason for the escalation of robocalls is that many of the offending callers anticipate a caller-friendly response from the FCC from their many requests to the FCC to loosen restrictions on robocalls. This is evidenced by the spike in calls that occurred right after last year's decision by the D.C. Circuit Court in ACA International versus FCC, illustrated on page 5 of my testimony. That decision set aside a 2015 order on the question of what calling systems are included in the TCPA's definition for an automated dialer. The calling industry's response to this decision is perfectly illustrated by the request by the U.S. Chamber, joined by 16 major national industries, requesting the FCC to loosen restrictions on robocalls. The TCPA is straightforward. It does not prohibit robocalls. It simply requires express consent before calls are made to cell phones with an automated dialer or a pre-recorded voice, or before telemarketing calls are made to residences. The law is not out of date, as some claim. The problem is that the callers want to make robocalls without worrying about having this consent, and they do not want to stop calling consumers when the consumers say stop. If their requests are granted, the number of automated calls will skyrocket, and there will be no protections against automated texts. Finally, the rules to stop unwanted robocalls must remain privately enforceable. Individual consumers harmed by invasive calls must be able to obtain redress for that harm, and private enforcement through class actions is essential to deter violations. FCC enforcement, unfortunately, does not accomplish this goal. The Wall Street Journal reported a few weeks ago, that the FCC had collected only $6,700 in fines against violators of the TCPA. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saunders. as I said earlier, I'm committed to protecting consumers from fraudulent and scam calls, and that's why I, along with Senator Markey, authored the TRACE Act to go after individuals who intentionally violate the law and prey on vulnerable populations. It is unfortunate that illegal robocalls have now increased to the point where people hardly want to pick up their phones at all. Consumers can also be harmed if they do not receive important time-sensitive calls that financial institutions, healthcare companies, and automakers make to their customers. Attorney General Peterson, do you think that you have the necessary tools to meet the challenge of tackling illegal robocallers so that consumers feel it's safe to answer their phone again?
One of the reasons I think the TRACE Act is going to be really advantageous to attorneys general is because technology is a big part of the answer, and I think with the stir-shaken guidelines, that will really help us. I think that's one of the more important elements that we see there, to stay in front of the technology if possible. The other part is the interagency cooperation will be important because I think as states we find more strength in working with the FCC or the FTC in some of these efforts. We've had a history of that, and I think the fact that in the bill it notes that the Attorney General should work with state attorneys general is an important element for us because this thing is always advancing. It's taking turns, and I think working together, we will be strengthened in enforcement.
Direct this to you, Attorney General Peterson, also Mr. Rupi. In the past, when I've asked enforcement and industry officials whether or not the do not call registry is broken, the responses made clear that it is most effective for folks who are making a good faith effort to comply with the law. The reality is that there are too many individuals like Adrian Abramovich who have no regard for the laws on the books, which is why I believe a credible threat of prosecution is necessary for illegal robocalls. Do you agree that threat of criminal prosecution is a necessary deterrent?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question, and it's an excellent question, and I wholeheartedly agree with that view. And I think I applaud the TRACE Act for what it does in establishing that interagency working group to facilitate that type of criminal enforcement. I think one of the things that is not lost on me is that when you look at Mr. Abramovich, he was a recidivist robocaller. So he was sued by AT&T in 2007. He was, the FCC acted aggressively against him in 2017, 2018. The FTC just last week announced a series of settlements with several individuals, Andy Salisbury, Aaron Michael Jones, James Cristiano, and the most disheartening aspect of that announcement was that the FTC referred to them as recidivist robocallers. They're doing this again and again and again, and I think individuals like that definitely need to be targeted through criminal enforcement. The best way to prevent illegal robocalls is to stop them from ever being made, and the best way to ensure that is put the people that are making them behind bars.
I think, Senator Thune, you mentioned in your opening about the cost of doing business, and I think that's a lot of these violators probably perceive it that way. Is if they're fined, they'll move on. I think when you bring up criminal penalties, that's when you get their attention. So that's why I support that.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Rupi, in your testimony, you mentioned industry's commitment to deploying the call authentication framework known as Stir Shaken. It's been discussed quite a bit here this morning already, but the bipartisan TRACE Act will help guide industry on the implementation of this much-needed call framework. Can you speak to how implementation of this framework will help consumers not receive spoofed calls? He's going to describe that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. So basically, the way I like to explain the shake and stir standard is as follows. It's obviously a very technologically complex standard and issue. But I think the best way to understand it is that it's effectively the equivalent of a notary public. When you go to a notary public with a document, they don't look at the document. They look at your driver's license and the signature you put on the line. So the stir, shake, and protocols and standards will do two things. Number one, they will authenticate the number that is originating that call. In other words, verifying that that is indeed the number calling. Number two, it will enhance traceback efforts. So when we trace back a call, we may go through 5, 6, 7 different providers to get to the point of origination. Because that call origination will be authenticated at the front end, we can hop right to that point to get to them. And that helps consumers in a couple of ways. Number one, it makes enforcement actions, whether civil or criminal, easier to pursue because we can find these people faster, and US Telecom is, through its traceback group, is doing that. But then number two, the standard will help inform a lot of the analytics that's taking place in the network and on the consumer's end in the various, hundreds of apps and services that are out there. So that will better inform their analytics in terms of how to handle that call. And just to be clear, especially early on, the lack of authentication on a call as the standard is being deployed is not necessarily going to be an indicator of whether that call is good or bad. But as implementation progresses, it will greatly enhance the analytics side for consumers.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you. Let me start with Ms. Saunders. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that the FCC has fined robocallers $208 million, but collected about $7,000. So in addition to the sort of cost of doing business question, the cost is actually close to zero. And I'm wondering how we can do better to improve the recovery rate.
Well, the recovery rate by the government is poor, but the recovery rate in private class actions is significant. And it's so, as unpopular as they are, it is the class actions that are driving compliance. And that's why the major industries are pushing the FCC to change the rules so that these class actions won't be available. But I would like to take a step back and look at what is driving all those robocalls that has been the subject of discussion today. Who's paying those robocallers? How are they making money? They're being paid. Those robocallers are lead generators. They're making the calls illegally. When they get someone on the phone who's interested in purchasing a home security or a car insurance or a life insurance contract, that's a live lead. They then refer that lead to a real American company, State Farm, Royal Cruises.
Oh, and it sort of launders the illegal activity and incentivizes it, but at some point it gets handed over to a legit business.
That's exactly right. And those legitimate businesses are paying for those calls, and then when they're sued, are paying for the leads, and then when they're sued for making illegal telemarketing robocalls without prior express consent, they say, we didn't know anything about the illegality. Our contract with this lead generator or this independent contractor requires them to comply with the law. We're not responsible.
I got it. Okay. So it seems to me there's the problem of the recovery rate. There's the problem of the sort of upstream, whatever you want to call it, the upstream or downstream companies that are benefiting from this, and plausible deniability through the contract itself. And then there's this question of criminal penalties, and I'd like to lead into the Attorney General with a question about how we can enhance AG's authorities here. Why don't you just offer us your thoughts on what AGs can be empowered to do and how that would make a difference?
Typically, the AGs are empowered by our own state laws, and frankly, I think a lot of legislative bodies are challenged to stay in front of this type of technology. So I'm a proponent of state solutions, but I also think the partnership with federal authorities is important here. I will say one of the challenges, whether or not it's a civil penalty or a criminal penalty, is the ability to get our hands around these people. in
To
Nebraska.
find them, to.
Yes, to actually get them in a headlock. And that's not easy to do. And in fact, we're fortunate we have one case where we have a partial player in a headlock. But that's always going to be the challenge. And so I think having in our toolbox the ability to enforce criminal penalties will help. But I don't think it's the silver bullet.
So the other thing I think offers an opportunity for consumers is, first of all, education, because I think there will be some number of robocalls happening, even if we do all the right policies. And so it seems to me that likely the most vulnerable among our constituents are still in danger of being not just spoofed and spammed, but really scammed and ripped off. And so we have to kind of work on the consumer education side, and then apps are going to provide some utility to people, but I kind of worry about having two tiers of phone users, those that are educated, know how to use an app to block all the nonsense, and those who don't. And so, Mr. Rupi, I'm wondering whether you can address that question. And just one more sort of nuance to this, which is there are now apps that you have to pay for to block robocalls, which I suppose is better than nothing, but it seems to me that this ought to be like a seatbelt. This ought to be both in sort of tech terms and in sort of public policy terms like a utility. We just don't allow robocalls. You don't have to pay to block them, and you don't have to forfeit your privacy to some telecommunications or tech company in order to have that utility. You just ought to be free of these things. So can you comment on that?
Thank you, Senator. Those are both great questions. So let me tackle the first of your questions. And I would respond to that by saying US Telecom has long believed, and I certainly believe, that there's no single silver bullet to the robocall problem, okay? There has to be a holistic, comprehensive approach that includes tools, that includes enforcement, that includes technologies like Shaken, but also education. Education is a huge component and an important component, and it's happening. You know, the example I give is that my 83-year-old mother up in New Jersey got the grandparent scam, and fortunately she has a son that talks to her relentlessly about robocalls. She didn't take the call. My in-laws had a friend down the street that was at the CVS buying the iTunes cards, and a clerk stopped the sale. Both those are examples of education, and education can be powerful. But again, no single thing in and of itself is going to solve this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz, and a good point there. The people probably most likely to get preyed on are the least technologically savvy, and so a lot of the consumer awareness things that we're talking about in many cases probably aren't going to get to some of the populations that are most likely to be subject to scams. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that we're having this hearing today. As you can see, this is an area where there is bipartisan agreement. And I think we all have our stories of family members that have received these calls and are just aggravated when they receive this number of calls. I want to, Mr. Rupi, ask you quickly, looking at the cost of this, and with Shake and Stir and the implementation, what is your concern that equipment vendors may escalate their price as you look at a date-certain implementation?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Senator. Just two quick points on that. I mean, number one, industry is heavily committed to deploying this standard. They're doing it. They're going to make it happen. They're committed to it. To the point on vendors, I do know that that is certainly an issue that some companies may be facing, particularly for smaller rural companies. There are a limited number of vendors that are out there. We are certainly hopeful that they can provide the equipment in a timely and reasonable manner. But, you know, that's certainly one factor that may be out there. But nevertheless, industry is definitely strongly committed.
So is it fair to say you all are watching that to make certain that we do not end up with those, with some of those being taken advantage of?
Absolutely, Senator. I think that's something that all of us,
Okay.
want to keep an interest in.
Let me ask you this, and this is to each of you there. In Tennessee, we have some companies that want to follow up with individuals that have contracted for their service. It may be home improvement, it may be lawn care, it may be health care, and they're prohibited of doing follow-up with those customers that are under contract to them because of the robocall rules. And so they've kind of gotten caught in this area. So how do you suggest that we go about ensuring that companies who have contracted with people for a service, whether it's something like lawn care or health care or repairmen, are not harmed during the implementation of this solution?
Saunders, you want to go first?
I'll jump at that first, Senator. Look, I think that's a crucial point. And from a technology perspective, at the end of the day, what we want to achieve, to Chairman Thune's point, we want to ensure that the bad illegal robocalls are stopped or blocked or mitigated, and that legal, legitimate calls will go through. Mr. Chairman, as you acknowledged in your speech yesterday, shaken is not going to be the silver bullet. It's not a panacea, but it can help authenticate legitimate calls so that legitimate businesses and individuals can make their legitimate calls while stopping the illegal robocalls.
Anyone want to add anything further to that? Ms. Saunders?
I think there is some misunderstanding about what you call the robocall rules. The Telephone Consumer Protection Act does not prohibit all robocalls. It only requires automated calls set to cell phones to include, to be consented to first. So those folks that are following up on inquiries, the inquiries
We have numerous companies that have had problems with that. And so as we look at Shake and Stir, what we want to do is make certain that they are not disadvantaged, because there have been problems in that, and they come to us regularly on these. My time is running out. I will just say to you, Mr. Peterson, the criminal penalties, I appreciate your comments about getting a bad actor in a headlock and feeling that criminal penalties. I just want to make certain that I understand you are saying you think the criminal penalties, as opposed to raising the cost or raising the fee on civil penalties, is going to be more helpful.
That's correct.
Okay, yield back, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn, and appreciate all the wrestling analogies here today, too. Next up is Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you all. It's a very important topic, and in my own state, robocalls doubled last year, and you know what the national volumes are, and I'm very pleased to be part of this bill, and I want to thank the leaders of the bill. Last week, I offered an amendment to the Traced Act to direct the FCC to establish a robocalls task force. This idea was not actually mine, it was Commissioner Rosenworcel's, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on these issues. I'm hoping we can get something going at the FCC. And do you think that the FCC could do more to combat illegal robocalls and establish a robocall task force? Do any of you want to comment on if you think that would be helpful? Yes, Mr. Ruby.
Thank you for that question, Senator. I'll just say that, certainly I think that's one of the things the Traced Act does, is by establishing this interagency working group. But I will also say that US Telecom and its 26-member industry traceback group is already working very collaboratively with the enforcement bureaus of both the FCC and FTC. We would love to work with state AGs. Industry wants to help advance those enforcement actions, and we applaud certainly the civil enforcement actions by both agencies. We think they're effective, and we share our traceback information with the FCC's Enforcement Bureau, who has this high priority for them as well as for Chairman Pai at the agency.
Ms. Saunders, you want to comment about this idea of the task force?
I'm sure it will be very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Saunders, we know that seniors are more often targeted, vulnerable to these schemes. And do you think additional information about emerging fraud schemes would help prevent seniors from being financially exploited? As Mr. Ruby mentioned, his own family, his own grandparents being subject to a scam. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right, where seniors believe they're giving money. And so this idea to me, at my former job, I was a county attorney, and we went around, we did a senior fraud task force all over the state. And getting the information out we found to the local areas about what these actual scams were was helpful, because then seniors could learn about them and anticipate them. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, Senator Klobuchar, I think that education is always a good thing and will be helpful. I've been working in consumer protection on behalf of low-income people for my entire career, which is now over 40 years. And I have to say that in all of the scams that we have tried to address, legal services and private attorneys working with the attorneys general, the thing that almost always works the best is enforcement. And whether it's public enforcement or private enforcement, education, unfortunately, will help only some people.
Exactly.
But will not help everyone.
And maybe we get to that, Mr. Peterson. I know that we've been using this figure that the FCC has ordered, $208.4 million for violators, but only collected around 6,000. Ms. Saunders mentioned this in her opening. Given the minimal amount of money collected, can you discuss how we're going to improve this process to hold these scammers accountable? It seems to me if they know that none of this money is really collected, they're just going to keep doing it.
You know, Senator, I'm not qualified really to go into the depths of the collection process.
Okay.
I will just tell you as a reality, it's difficult for us because of the questions or the concerns we've discussed as far as being able to locate them and to actually ascertain their assets.
And it'd be easier if it was some of it done on the federal level, is what you're saying.
That would help.
Yes.
But on the education front, we actually travel all around the state of Nebraska and set up in senior centers to explain this. The kind of the sad thing about that is you can fully set out the scams. They'll go home the next day and they're lonely and the phone rings. And we say, look at caller ID. If you don't recognize it, let them leave a message, but they give it a shot anyway. So
Yeah.
I think that will always be a challenge.
Right. Anyone want to add about the collections and how we can improve this?
I think the problem is that the people that are being prosecuted are the lead generators, and they don't have any money. And the way to actually increase enforcement is to go after the people who are paying them for those leads, which are the big corporations.
So it takes more of a sort of in-depth prosecutions to
Yes.
get there and investigations.
That's right.
Mr. Ruby?
I would just add, Senator, that that's where I believe criminal enforcement is especially key. I mean, when you look at the fact that the individuals I cited at the FTC, a billion robocalls, illegal robocalls annually, Abramovich, I think it was 400 million in 3
Yeah.
months, so.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the numbers are for the FTC personnel and justice on this kind of thing. I do know, just because of a somewhat related issue, antitrust, I was looking at those numbers, and they have gone down from their height by quite remarkably, the number of employees working on these. And meanwhile, in that area, just like this, you have more and more detailed, sophisticated proposals, we'll call them, in that case, mergers, but in this case, schemes. And it's just, everyone knows that they're outmatched, so they just keep doing it. So it makes the problem even worse. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Mr. Attorney General will recognize your senator from the great state of Nebraska, Senator Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the millions of Americans, it is critical that we effectively address the many concerns voiced by consumers, voice service providers, private businesses, state law enforcement, and federal regulators. We could not have this discussion today without the important voice of our state attorneys general, and so I am pleased to welcome Nebraska Attorney General Doug Peterson to the subcommittee today. AG Peterson is well-versed on the Trace Act. He led all 50 state attorneys general in addition to the District of Columbia and 3 U.S. territories in a letter to this committee voicing support for the bill's provisions. So thank you, General Peterson, for being here today. As we're looking at the issue before us, and as you know very well, many of the recent robocall enforcement actions led by the FTC involved collaboration with state partners. What attributes of collaboration between federal agencies and state partners have been the most helpful in these enforcement sweeps?
Well, I think the scope of the remedies that the federal authorities have are something that, because you have a variety of different state laws in the area, having the federal legislation to enforce is important and helpful. That's why we think the interagency working group is also very important, because in a variety of things, the combination of states working together with the FTC is a much stronger combination. It gives you better avenues and options as far as courts. In fact, 43 states have come together on this specific topic to work closely with the FTC, and that's why we're appreciative of the bill actually identifying the importance of meeting with attorney generals. I think specifically our enforcement is typically difficult if we're just limited within our own state authorities, and that's why you see the multi-state efforts. And I think we're much stronger if we work together with the FTC and the FCC in doing this. Also, even in the regulations, in developing the regulations, the opportunity to have input of what we see, I guess, on the street, if you will.
When you have that interagency working group, do you think a main benefit would be that it will really clarify communication, to make that clear communication more effective across the country?
I do, because we have the same goal. The goal is very clear, and to work together as two enforcement bodies, I think, makes it even stronger.
And last year, the estimated number of illegal robocalls surged by more than 36%, and it reached nearly 48 billion illegal robocalls. As we see advances in technology, it just costs pennies for these to take place, and so a lot of bad actors profit from that enormous amount of calls that we're seeing. General Peterson, can you highlight how requiring comprehensive implementation of STIR/SHAKE and the standards that are in there, as the Trace Act does as well, how can we address the root cause of the problem? You know, it is so irritating to have these calls 24 hours a day from numbers that you think must be a neighbor calling.
Yeah,
and they spoof you on it. But so how can we address this, the root of the problem on it?
Well, I think STIR/SHAKEN is one major step for that, because what it does is it puts the industry in the position of using their technical expertise to be part of the solution. I say up to this point in time, oftentimes the consumer was given the burden of responsibility to whether downloading apps or doing things of that nature. And so those who were, careful consumers would go through the steps, but particularly the elderly who are not very advanced in the technology, they always have to have their grandchildren do their phones and things of that nature. The message we've always done in our consumer protection efforts in this area has always been utilize your caller ID, utilize your caller ID. And when they start getting fooled by spoofing, then that advice seems to have less effect. And now with the STIR/SHAKEN programs being developed, I think we can feel a little bit more confident by giving that counsel that they know it's from an authentic source.
I'm just very pleased to see a bipartisan approach here and consensus from every state, and I certainly appreciate your leadership in this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Who came up with stir shaken?
A bunch of engineers, Mr.
And James Bond fans, evidently.
I think Senator Thune means who came up with the acronym, not the technology. Was it engineers?
Stir shaken. It wasn't.
It was a bunch of engineers, yes. Yes, it was.
Named Bond. James Bond.
Thank you all for being here. I want to pick up on a point that Senator Schatz raised. There's an article that I saw today. I think it may have reported the fact that he cited, and I'm going to ask that it be entered into the record if there's no objection. The headline is, "The FCC has fined robocallers $208 million. It's collected $6,790. Mr. Ruby, do you have an explanation for why that is?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I think just two things real quick. Number one, I think my understanding of how the FCC can collect those funds, they basically have to make the referral to DOJ, and then, DOJ basically has to enforce that.
So DOJ is not enforcing the FTC orders?
It's not that they're not, the orders are enforced by the FCC, but it's the collection of the funds that falls into the Department of Justice's.
Well, that's what I mean.
Authority.
The orders are enforced. The FTC is the plaintiff, but are you saying DOJ is the one who goes to court?
Correct.
And they're not going to court?
Correct. But the other point I would raise, Senator, is that while there is that collection issue, I do believe, US Telecom certainly believes, that those enforcement actions do have a positive impact. I mean, just as an example, last year, the Enforcement Bureau chief sent letters to intransigent carriers that weren't supporting traceback. US Telecom's traceback program, saw an uptick in supportive carriers after those letters went out. So I do think, we have to look at the positive effect that those types of enforcement actions have on industry.
Well, they may have a positive impact, but they'd have a lot more positive impact if the collections were made. And I agree totally with Attorney General Peterson, having been an Attorney General myself, that nothing speaks as loudly as prison time.
Senator, wholeheartedly agree there. I think that's the most effective.
At the end of the day, what really matters for consumers is the ability to block these calls. That's the most effective tool, and the technology exists to block these calls. I've joined Commissioner Rosenworcel in calling on carriers to make robocall blocking tools available to their customers for free. Most of them now charge a fairly steep monthly bill for this blocking technology. And I am introducing today a measure, it's called the Robocop bill, that would require the carriers to provide this technology for free to every consumer. Give them control. Would you support that bill?
Senator, I think one of the things that I would point to is there is tremendous deployment of these tools by a variety of carriers, and some are free, some are not. But many carriers are deploying a variety of tools, both, on the edge and in the networks and on the apps. And it's certainly my view that that diversity in tools and diversity in approaches to empowering consumers is the best approach.
But why not just require that it be provided for free?
I think, number one, Senator, I think
I
that's...
don't understand the argument for diversity. I mean, diversity is a great thing, but a lot of carriers are not providing it free of charge.
I think many carriers are deploying tools
Why
that...
not require it for free?
Some are free, some
Okay, so you're, I don't mind if you don't want to answer the question, but I have limited time. So let me go on. Ms. Saunders, what do you think? Shouldn't it be required for free?
Senator Blumenthal, you have already sponsored a lot of bills that I think have moved the ball forward, and we really appreciate that. I'm not sure, frankly, that I do agree that it should be always provided for free. When a phone carrier is required to provide something, someone has to pay for that. It's generally the ratepayers, not the stockholders. When the ratepayers pay for it, that causes the rates to go up. That affects the poorest ratepayers, the low-income homeowners who are paying for residential landline. An often $5 or $10 difference a month can make the difference between whether they can afford that landline or not. So I fully support call blocking, but I'm not necessarily sure that requiring phone companies to provide them for free helps the people that you want to help the most, which are those that really can't afford to pay those fees, because it may mean that not only do they not have call blocking, but they don't have their phones. It's at least an issue that we are considering, that we represent those poor people, those low-income people who struggle to pay their landline bills.
Is there a difference between the prepaid and other consumers?
I think there is a difference. Some of the lowest income consumers have cell phones which are Lifeline, and those are often prepaid, and some are on contracts. I'm not sure how that goes to call blocking,
So
frankly.
you would agree with Mr. Rupee that the diversity is a good thing?
My point is, sir, is that call blocking is an interim measure that needs to be implemented. But the ultimate measure is that we need to figure out how to stop the illegal calls, and the Trace Act is a very good step in that direction, but it won't complete the problem until we give consumers control over who gets to call their phone lines. And that, I think, really lies with implementation of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Gardner.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here today, and thank you to Chairman Thune for convening this very important hearing. The only thing that I can think that Coloradans might universally despise more than the Los Angeles or Oakland or Las Vegas Raiders or whoever they are robocalls. And just like everyone else around this dais, my state is getting inundated with them. According to UMail's Robocall Index, Coloradans received 30.7 million robocalls in March of 2017. That's more than 989,000 calls per day and more than 41,000 calls per hour. But that was 2 years ago. In March of this year, UMail estimates that Coloradans received a whopping 73.6 million robocalls. That's an approximately 140% increase in robocalls to Coloradans over the past 2 years. That's equivalent to 2.4 million calls per day, nearly 99,000 calls per hour, and just over 27 calls per second every single day in a state of 5.5 million people. But these are just averages. Many in Colorado have it far worse than the average. For example, I received a letter from a constituent in Loveland who emailed me at 11 a.m. one day to let me know that he had already received 11 robocalls that morning. A husband and wife in their 70s who live in Delta sent me a letter telling me the calls start at 8:30 in the morning and last late into the evening with nearly nonstop recordings and robocalls about medical supplies and financial offers. They're on the do not call list, but that doesn't stop the scammers and incessant calls. Enough is enough. We simply have to stop this. Even my staffers' desk lines here in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to get this opened up, are getting robocalls from spoofed internal Senate phone numbers. A phone call that looks like it came from the Senate is a scammer. One of my staffers was actually connected to a scammer this week through a robocall at his desk line, and the scammer tried to get him to divulge his personal credit card details to secure lower interest rates. And I'm going to play just a few seconds of that call. And the scammer has figured out how to disable the phone. I don't know if it's on, not on speaker there or what. But I hope that people will take some time to listen to this call. If anybody's interested in hearing the transcript of this, they should. Because I was going to play about 7 seconds of it, where they tried over and over to get and divulge the...
Verify me the card name as it starts with number 4.
The card number, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just so you know, you just called the United States Senate line, and this has been recorded, and we know that this is an instance of fraud.
Oh.
Yes.
Now, I stopped it there because the next words have probably never been entered into the congressional record before, and I don't want people to hear this listening live. I hope that people will, if anybody's interested, hear this and what this person tried to do to access and did everything they could to access this. Now, if this was maybe my 95-year-old grandmother who got this phone call, she'd have been pretty intrigued by what this gentleman had to say and the dangers that that poses. So this call ended with this. My staffer said the U.S. government is aggressively pursuing criminal activities. And the scammer replied to him, "Sure, if you can, I'll be waiting for you." It's on this call. Think of that. I'll be waiting for you. These criminals are taunting us because they think we won't act. They think we can't reach them. Congress has waited too long to take more aggressive action on robocalls, and these scammers think that they're invincible. That's why I was proud to co-sponsor the TRACE Act, legislation designed to crack down on these kinds of calls and promote better coordination among federal agencies. I thank Senators Thune and Markey for their leadership on that effort and for this committee passing the bill at our most recent markup. Mr. Ruppy, the Department of Justice announced last year that they had sentenced 24 defendants in a multi-million-dollar international robocall scheme based in India. U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado provided significant support for that operation, and I was pleased to see the aggressive action the DOJ took in this instance. You indicated in your testimony that we still need to improve coordination between the FCC, FTC, and DOJ to pursue criminal charges against the worst robocall offenders. I'm going to ask you for the record what more we can do, and will we have to have the complete support of US Telecom's membership in pursuing justice for every Coloradan and everyone else in this country? We're going to get to that. I'm going to run out of time, but I just want to thank you. And the federal government and private sector alike, we've got a lot to do when it comes to preventing robocalls. And according to the FCC, approximately 60% of the complaints they get are regarding unwanted calls. Coloradans are sick and tired of this. They're sick and tired of the interruptions, the constant scamming, the constant gaming, the nonstop ringing, and it needs to stop. So Congress should pass the TRACE Act as soon as possible. The President should sign it into law, and I stand ready to work with anyone who's willing to do just that, and we'll follow up with you on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. Appreciate that. Next up is my partner on this, Senator from Massachusetts, Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, so much. And nothing is more bipartisan than the scourge of robocalls. This is something that unites everyone in America. We realize that something very bad has happened, that there is a sinister side of cyberspace, that really terrible things can happen as well as very good things. And when I was authoring the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act back in 1991, we were in a relatively prosaic era, it turns out, in terms of robocalls. And the goal then was to make sure that people, whether at home or on their mobile phones, consumers should not be subject to intrusive and unsolicited calls. But this precious zone of privacy and control is under massive attack today because technology has evolved. Scammers can now easily robocall consumers en masse using technology as basic as a modern smartphone. That's all they need. They just need a smartphone, and they're in business in sending tens of thousands of unwanted calls to people. And the fraudsters can easily spoof their numbers in which they conceal their actual identity and instead make it seem like the call is coming from someone in your neighborhood when it's coming from someplace, as Senator Gardner is saying, unknown and more likely than not international. But it's been disguised as it's coming into people's home. And in March, as the chairman mentioned, consumers received an estimated 5.2 billion robocalls, and more than 55 million came to my constituents in Massachusetts. And the onslaught of robocalls has rattled consumers' confidence in their mobile devices. Caller ID isn't trusted. Important calls go unanswered. Innocent Americans are defrauded. Robocalls are a menace in our country. And just last week, this committee sent a clear message to fraudulent robocallers: your days are numbered. The committee unanimously passed the Traced Act, bipartisan legislation that has received the unanimous support of this committee, and we thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your incredible work in putting together that coalition. In stopping robocalls, however, requires a simple formula: authentication, blocking, and enforcement. And this bill does achieve all three. And it's received, and we thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for your support. The Attorneys General of all 54 states and territories Attorneys General, all of the Federal Communications Commissioners, all of the Federal Trade Commissioners, major industry associations, and leading consumer groups. So let me go to you first, Ms. Saunders. Estimates suggest that this year almost half of all calls to mobile phones will be from spoofed numbers. Half of all calls to mobile phones in America in a year will be from spoofed numbers. How will the Traced Act address the pressing challenge to the authenticity of our telephone networks?
Senator Markey, thank you for the question and thank you for your leadership on this issue. The Traced Act will require that the phone companies originating the phone calls will validate that the caller ID matches the actual phone number from which the call is coming, and that will bring us much farther along the road to ensuring that we can believe our caller IDs and we will know who is calling us.
So, so there's an enforcement working group to identify better opportunities to better prosecute illegal robocallers. So, Attorney General Peterson, what enforcement challenges do you face, and how do you think the working group could help alleviate those challenges?
Well, I think the working group, among the Attorneys General, this interagency working group is going to be very important. As I said, already 43 state AGs have come together and want to coordinate with the feds as how best we can collectively use federal law and state law. What are the best forums? What are the best investigative tools? So the problem is so significant that in order to have any opportunity to be effective, I think there's got to be this combined effort. That's why we were very encouraged to see the specific language in the bill with regards to the interagency working groups.
Yeah, and again, can you once again just state how many, what percent of all the complaints that come to your office are with regard to unwanted calls?
For us, it's over 60%, but I know every state's a little bit different, but the volume is what's so significant. And probably in the last 2 years, how that volume has just accelerated at a rate with the technology and the accessibility that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, so, Mr. Rupi, the Traced Act establishes binding requirements for telephone providers to adopt call authentication and blocking technologies. What type of impact will the adoption of these protections have on curbing the meteoric rise in the number of unwanted robocalls?
Thank you for that question, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this issue and this bill. And I think the Trace Act will do two important things. One is Attorney General Peterson noted, and Ms. Saunders, it will authenticate that number. It will restore trust in that number. And that's important to both consumers and on the analytics side as we look for, try to separate the good calls from the bad calls. Second thing it'll do, it'll enhance traceback. And to Senator Gardner's point, US Telecom's industry traceback group can find these individuals. We've traced them back to Croatia, India, Dominican Republic. We can find them. And, there have been enforcement actions against call centers in India, and I would encourage those types of actions, which were, facilitated by the FTC.
Thank you. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I thank Ranking Member Schatz and Cantwell, Chairman Wicker. This has been bipartisan. There are no blue robocalls or red robocalls. There are just irritating robocalls. And that's why it's so important that we take action. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. And I join my voice in the irritation category of spoofing. I can tell you, just walking, around, whether you're grocery shopping or something, it's inevitable somebody's going to say, can you do something about these spoofing calls and these numbers that come in? And so I'm glad that the Trace Act is moving in that direction. Here's my concern. If through the tools that we're giving in the Trace Act to block and authenticate, I mean, there are people out there now trying to figure out how to get around that. And so I guess my question is, in this bill, do we give the ability for the FCC and others to sort of look beyond to the next algorithmic scam that's going to be coming down the pike? Mr. Hoopie.
Thank you for that question, Senator. Yes, there are definitely provisions in the bill that look towards forward-thinking developments on this issue. And the fact of the matter is that this is a constantly evolving challenge. I think industry has done an admirable job of not only developing these standards and deploying them, but also looking at ways to deploy, powerful and important tools for consumers. So as the bad actors change their tactics, which they inevitably will, I think there is definitely a good, strong effort by industry to basically counteract that.
Good.
And the bill addresses that.
Good. Ms. Saunders, one of the issues that came to my attention was a younger woman whose mother, who would be a senior, she said, my mother doesn't answer the phone anymore. She's afraid to answer the phone as a senior. She's afraid to answer the phone. Even if she knows the number, she just doesn't trust it anymore because of these spoofing calls and robocalls. And so I see it as a real potential, if we don't get a handle on this, a real potential for fraud, obviously, for a senior, but also some really serious safety concerns, particularly for seniors who really rely on the phone and maybe have one or two folks that they call every day. And if somebody's calling in to say, watch out, the river's rising, you got to get out of here, they're not answering those calls. Have you looked at that as a particular issue in terms of how this affects seniors?
Senator Capito, it's nice to see you.
Good to see you.
We have been complaining about robocalls as being a major source of the reduction of value in our telephones. As Senator Schatz noted, it is a really serious problem. We are trying to identify all the different causes for this, and the spoofing is one of the worst elements of the problem. We do think that the Trace Act will make a big, big difference. But I feel like a broken record here because I keep saying the same thing, that it is not all that needs to be done. We also must continue to give consumers control over who calls them. especially over automated calls to them. And that means strong implementation of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which will allow the example that you're providing to go on the do not call registry and know that that means that any telemarketer that calls her, unless she has given prior express written consent, will have violated that law, and that she can call the private attorneys or the Attorney General, the FCC, and the FCC can go after that caller.
Okay, good, thank you. Mr. Attorney General, do you feel that your office, I mean, some of this is pretty complicated stuff. I mean, it's in terms of, it's not complicated when you get a call. That's the uncomplicated part, but the unwinding of it all is very complicated. Do you feel that as a state attorney general, you have the resources within your office or another state would have to handle this, or would you think it would be better if you banded together and used an expertise, maybe, I'm just concerned about overloading your office, number one, but also making sure these are specialized telecom statutes.
No, I appreciate the question, Senator. I had mentioned earlier and didn't really define it that well, but North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein and also New Hampshire Attorney General Gordon McDonald made the effort to coordinate attorney generals, and I think 43 AGs are now engaged in the process and retained an expert, because you're exactly right. The technology moves so quickly, and to be quite honest, we're among our AGs, we have limited talents in that area of technology. So what they did is they retained the former FCC Chief of Technology, Dr. Henning Schultz-Renzi. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but anyway, to have that type of consultant.
To answer this question.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we recognize our shortcomings as far as being able to have the bandwidth in our own office with these challenges. And so I think that shows that we're trying to stay in front of it by getting some of the best in the industry to consult with. And that's how we deal with a lot of variety of issues we face.
All right, thank you. Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Chairman Thune. I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate it very, very much. If there's one thing we all agree on, these are a pain in the neck, okay? But I want to go off of what Senator Capito was saying about the fact that elderly people aren't answering their phone anymore, and there's a lot of problems with that. Do any of you have any data on the number of calls that are going unanswered? In other words, is the number of calls being answered going down?
Senator, thank you for that question, and it's a good one, but I don't think there's any data set on that. There's certainly anecdotal data that people are picking up their phone less, or, as the Attorney General Peterson noted, letting it go to voicemail.
Okay. So a couple questions that kind of spin off of this whole thing that have come to mind here. Several times during this conversation, Mrs. Saunders, you have talked about the fact that the TRACE Act is a great first step, but quite frankly, the full implementation of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act needs to happen, which contains the do not call list. Is there any teeth in that do not call list? So I'm on a do not call list. I still get the damn calls. And so when I tell them I'm on a do not call list, they kind of laugh. Is there any teeth in that do not call list?
There are some teeth in it, but the cases are unfortunately difficult to bring because TRACE Act has not yet been implemented.
Okay.
But there is a private right of action, but it is inadequate. Senator Durbin actually is about to introduce a bill that tremendously adds to the private right of action under the do not call list.
Well, that's a good thing, I think, although I haven't seen the bill yet, and I always reserve the right. But what you're saying is if the TRACE Act is implemented, which hopefully we can do it by UC, quite frankly. If it's implemented, that makes the Telephone Consumer Protection Act more powerful and more enforceable?
Yes, sir.
Good. Talked about, does anybody know the percentage of robocalls that are coming from offshore, from foreign countries?
I don't think we know that, sir. I haven't seen any statistics. Do you?
That's another area that's lacking, Senator, and that's one of the challenges in this area. Is there's not the FCC acknowledged in its recent report that the data out there is very scattered and inconclusive.
Well,
But,
Go ahead, go ahead, finish up.
there are certainly a significant portion of the traffic comes from overseas, but I would note that in the cases involving Adrian Abramovich and Aaron Michael Jones, they were orchestrating those calls domestically. So in other words, Adrian Abramovich was based in Miami, Florida. He had a call center in Mexico generating the calls.
May I add something?
You may.
Mr. Abramovich and others are lead generators, and they're paid by sellers of real goods and services. And if we are able to hold the sellers of those goods and services responsible for the making of the calls by their lead generators, that will stop a lot of these calls. At the moment, they are defending the actions and saying, we know nothing.
You make a very good point. So let me ask you, and maybe this is a question for the Attorney General. So we pass the Trace Act. We allow the Telephone Consumer Protection Act to be fully enforced. Can we go after those folks who are paying to have this done?
If the current law is good, but the industry, the calling industry is pushing the FCC and the courts to change the law and make the callers independently liable, but make the sellers and responsible for the callers not liable. That's the push. That's one of the issues that's pending.
So talk to me.
So,
no, the question is are we going down a line that's enforceable, or are we going down a line that will never happen? It looks to me that you go after the money, okay? And if these dudes don't have money, then or don't have enough money or whatever, go after the folks that are creating the problem to begin with. What's your view on that, Mr. Rupee?
Senator, the main point I wanted to raise was that Adrian Abramovich, when the FCC issued its citation, it noted he wasn't saying I'm calling from Adrian Abramovich Resorts.
No.
He was co-opting the names of Disney Resorts, Marriott, Hilton, et cetera. So, you know, in a lot of instances, these lead generators are purporting to be from these organizations, and that is not the case.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm in the business of taking phone calls as a U.S. Senator, and I leave a lot of them. And quite frankly, what really ticks me off is when they call me, I don't get a real person. I get a damn computer that's talking to me, and it takes me 15, 20 seconds to figure out it's a computer, and then when I call them back, I get a busy signal. Drives me crazy. But it's probably good they don't answer. And I would also say on a foreign call, I can't imagine that many regular people get many calls from foreign countries. Just, I've been here for 62 years, and I've had a handful of them, okay? That hand. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I want to thank each of you for sharing your views on this important issue. It's really important to people that I represent. We've dealt with this issue of robocalls in the state of Indiana in a very public way for decades now. In fact, for a period of time, I characterize this as the #1 public policy issue among Hoosiers, getting what they regard as annoying calls, dinner time, interrupting their daily lives. Still today, it's not uncommon. I'll hear from Hoosiers. They get 10 calls a day from people they don't know. They didn't ask for the call, and so forth. So I'm glad we're having this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're taking some action to crack down. In 2018, UMail, it's a third-party software company, they've indicated that approximately 725 million robocalls were placed to Indiana recipients. Now, if used properly, I want to acknowledge robocalls, they don't have to be burdensome. If you have the proper consent between parties and all that's worked out, many services utilize pre-recorded calls, and they share important information with constituents and customers. But at their worst, as you know, there are criminals out there who have the ability to steal people's information, to steal their resources, and to prey on unsuspecting American citizens. So, again, I'm glad we've moved forward with the first step here with the Trace Act, but we have to continue to review this issue, and I look forward to working with all of you as we do that to see how we can empower regulators and, if necessary, consumers additionally to combat this problem. Constituents tell me that oftentimes I hear they're on the national do not call list, they are on our state's do not call list, and yet they still receive unsolicited phone calls. And they can't figure out why that is. That doesn't seem right to them. As it's currently envisioned, the shake and stir standards would authenticate each call and allow the recipient to answer the phone with confidence. However, with the current use of voice traffic over the internet, phone spammers can route calls through a private telephone network based here in the United States. If marked as spam under these standards, the operators can easily reestablish another operation. So my question for the panel is, how would you suggest adapting these proposed standards or national enforcement to stop private telephone network operators from setting up operations all over again to continue making these unsolicited robocalls?
Senator, thank you for that question. It's a very good question, and I think the TRACE Act does two things that are going to help with that. The facilitation of the interagency working group, shake and stir, will make finding those actors easier and faster. But I really think at the end of the day, the criminal enforcement component, so that when they get caught that first time, they can't set up shop again because they're in a jail cell.
You know, the only thing, and Senator, I'd like to thank the state of Indiana, because I know the Attorney General's office in Indiana has been one of the leaders among the AGs in this fight, along with Missouri.
A shout out goes to Attorney General Carter and Attorney General Zeller in our state. They were very active on this front, and I know that the effort continues with our current AG.
AG Hill, yes. I would just, to me, the regulations will be important, and I think having the opportunity for the FCC to get the input of the states, we consider to be an important effort. But this acceleration of technology, I think, is always going to be our challenge, and that's why the industry's cooperation is going to be so important.
Ms. Sanders, I'm sorry, I can't see your name tag. Yes. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, sir.
Okay. So I would just note the stir shaken framework confirms the identity color of the caller, not the content of the call. Do we need to be doing anything with respect to the content, or you think the identity is where we should stop in this effort?
Senator, I think that the authentication of the number is a very good start. That's an important start. Spoofing has been the key driver, or one of the key drivers for robocalls. Authenticating who is associated with that number, that's an important step as well, and I know that's something industry is definitely looking at.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Young. My understanding is that Senator Sinema is en route. Did you have another question, Senator Markey? Anything quick one?
I have, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have questions for the record.
You do, okay. Well, if you want to ask, go ahead. I mean, we're going to wait for, we've got one more member that's on their way here. So
if I can play that role that I'd be glad to do it. So let me, there's an entire industry out there solely predicated on contacting consumers by any means possible, and the only thing preventing these callers from bombarding the public and unlimited number of unwanted calls is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and consent is the bedrock of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and while technology may change, the key principle does not. And therefore, it is the FCC's obligation to use its authority to adapt to changing technologies and ensure consumers have robust, enforceable protections against the onslaught of unwanted and abusive calls and texts. And their work is more important now than ever because the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals struck down portions of the FCC's 2015 rules, which updated protections for the smartphone era. And while the court case was a setback, the spirit and intent of the TCPA is always very clear. Callers must have affirmative permission from the consumer before using auto dialers, which are technologies that can call and text countless consumers at one time. And consumers should always have reasonable means to revoke consent to say no from receiving any more calls or texts. So, Ms. Saunders, is there any reason why the Federal Communications Commission cannot use its authority under the TCPA to ensure consumers have an easy way to revoke consent and require callers using auto dialers to receive permission before calling or texting a consumer?
Thank you for the question, Senator Markey. The issue before the FCC, there's a number of issues, the two big issues you've just identified. One is how to define or how to interpret the definition for auto dialer. The reason the ACA case was sent back to the FCC by the D.C. Circuit Court was that it said that the 2015 FCC order was too broad and that as it read, it covered all smartphones. The FCC now has before it a number of comments from consumer groups and industry arguing that concept. And we have pointed out to the FCC that smartphones, as they come from the factory, do not have the capacity, the current capacity, to make automated calls. So to quibble with you slightly, Senator Markey, you said that smartphones could be automated dialers. That is not the case unless they add applications. And that's a critical distinction to make for the FCC. If the FCC were to include all smartphones, the case would be sent back again. But we think we've shown to them how they can avoid that. If the FCC does what the industry wants and defines automated dialers as the U.S. Chamber and other callers have asked, the definition will not cover any of the dialers out there. The consequences will be that all these automated calls will be completely unregulated, and there will not be any way to say stop because the TCPA won't apply to them.
Okay, so your response is that the Federal Communications Commission has clear authority,
Yes, sir.
and if strong protections are not established, consumers would lose their right to provide and revoke consent for many calls. And I agree with that, and that's why so many members of the Senate are communicating with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai to adopt key protections, a comprehensive definition of auto dialer, ensuring all callers must receive permission before robocalling or robotexting a consumer, and preserving a consumer's right to revoke consent should they no longer wish to receive calls or texts. And if the FCC fails to fulfill their legislative mandate, it's going to be imperative for this committee once again to take action in order to ensure that consumers always have the right to say no to robocalls.
Yes, may I respond? Senator Markey, you yourself wrote a letter. You've written several letters to the FCC, but you specifically wrote a letter on this point, which we appreciate because it supports the consumer's view of the necessity for the FCC to appropriately interpret the statutory definitions.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for participating today. I'm sure you've heard this from other folks on the panel, but in Arizona, people are frustrated by the barrage of illegal robocalls, which interrupt family dinners, ruin people's movies nights, and occasionally even wake them up in the middle of the night. But beyond frustration, illegal robocalls frequently support fraudulent scams that threaten the personal and financial security of Arizona seniors, families, and businesses. We know the FCC estimates nearly half of all cell phone calls received this year will be spam. And according to a recent study, robocalls reached record highs in every Arizona area code in 2018. In June of 2018 alone, Arizonans received 78.3 million robocalls. I hear from constituents every day about annoying, burdensome, and dangerous robocalls. One family, Donald and Rosemary, who live in Mesa, are harassed as early as 6:30 in the morning by robocalls. Alejandro, who's a volunteer in an Arizona County Sheriff's Department, receives robocalls at work, which distract him from his duties. Eric, a constituent in Phoenix, worries that his 82-year-old mother will get scammed by a robocall or that she might stop answering the phone altogether. So as robocalls disrupt the lives of hardworking Arizonans, they deserve much-needed relief, which is why I'm proud to have co-sponsored our bipartisan legislation, the TRACE Act, which this committee recently approved to crack down on illegal robocalls and hold perpetrators accountable. Our bill increases criminal penalties and promotes call authentication and blocking technologies. And I'm committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure that that TRACE Act becomes law. As Eric from Phoenix said to me, no one should be held hostage by their own device. So my first question this morning is for Mr. Rupi. If enacted, the TRACE Act would require voice service providers to adopt call authentication technologies to verify the identity of incoming calls before connecting the consumer. Can you explain the stir-shaken technology and how it will prevent Arizonans from receiving these unwanted robocalls?
Thank you for that question, Senator. And yes, the Act does that, and industry is committed to deploying that standard. They're doing that now. And basically, the way the standard works, I've equated it to a notary public. When that call gets originated, the number is authenticated. Basically, the company originating that call says, I own this number, I know it's coming from, my network, and it passes through the network, and in each subsequent hop, each network it goes through, that number continues to be authenticated throughout the process. So it does, it will work on a pure IP network. Comcast and AT&T have already had successful handoffs of that. Verizon's done the same. So at the end of the day, what it will do is when that consumer sees that number on their caller ID that's been authenticated, they will know that that is indeed the number. Now, it doesn't authenticate the content of the call, but nevertheless, the authentication of that number is a powerful and important step.
Thank you. My next question is for Ms. Saunders, but I also welcome the thoughts of Mr. Peterson. A recent report by the Wall Street Journal indicates that although the FCC and FTC have imposed large penalties on illegal robocalls, only a very small amount of those fines have been collected. So the FCC has levied over $200 million in fines, but has collected only about $7,000. So how will the TRACE Act improve enforcement of the law, and how can we better partner with state authorities to ensure enforcement for these types of violations?
I think the TRACE Act will improve enforcement of the law by providing the enforcers, both private and public and government enforcement officials, to determine who is making the calls, and then they can bring actions against them. In terms of collecting more fines and fees, I think the problem may be that the people that are being prosecuted don't actually have the money. And as I've been saying, is that we need to also make sure that we can go after the sellers of goods and services for whom these robocallers are actually making the calls and providing the leads. In my testimony in footnotes beginning on page 2, I've detailed a number of class actions brought privately that are against home security systems and crews selling robocall systems, and Hilton and other telemarketers who are responsible for those robocalls, even if they're not actually making them.
Senator, the only thing I would add to that is the TRACE Act will help. It'll give us greater options. It'll also create, I think, even stronger interagency and federal and state cooperation. It's not to say that there's never been any type of significant collections here, but for example, in 2017, there were 4 attorney generals, and the US DOJ obtained a $280 million judgment against DISH. So there has been some effective enforcement, but I agree with Ms. Saunders. I think one of the bigger challenges is sometimes the collectability of the players and their fluid operations.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but thank you again for hosting this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. And as we wrap up, I think we want to get these bad actors in a headlock, as was alluded to earlier. And so hopefully we can move the legislation forward. It occurred to me, I was listening to all this, that not only you run the danger, obviously, of people who are being preyed upon by scam artists and fraud and everything else, but you also, there seems to me an inherent danger when people are no longer picking up legitimate calls that might relate to their own health and safety, and so particularly elderly people. And that, to me, seems to be yet another reason why we need to get this issue addressed. So, been very helpful this morning. Thank you all, as always, for your input and testimony. We will keep the hearing record open for a couple of weeks, and so if members have questions that they want to submit for the record, if you would please respond to those as quickly as possible, and we'll include those as a part of the permanent hearing record. I do want to ask if there's a letter from ITTA in support of Traced, that be made a part of the hearing record, and we will look forward working with our colleagues on this committee, Senator Markey and I, and hopefully in a very bipartisan way, moving this legislation across the finish line and onto the President's desk for his signature. I think we have 53 co-sponsors at the moment, and hopefully there will be more as time progresses. So thank you all again, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.